It's the 27th of April, 1984. I'm in Vancouver at the University of British Columbia School of Social Work. Today I'm interviewing Miss Amy Lee. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Miss Lee, in order to begin, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born and a little bit about your background.
I was born in England, in Cheshire.
And when were you born?
Hmm?
When were you born?
When? 1897.
And did you live your early life in England?
15 years. I got my early education there, and we came out to Canada in 1913, directly to Vancouver. And I have lived around ever since. That was Burnaby.
You had mentioned before we started this morning that when you were a child in Britain, you had some involvement with helping the poor.
Well, it was we lived in a small village, and at that time there were so many poor people with no program. They certainly didn't have their welfare program at that time, and a lot of widows particularly were in very dire straits, and so many of the people in the village would help. And every Saturday morning I had two sisters, and our job was to see that some of these needy people got a little help. That may have given me a bit of a clue, I don't know. I was quite young at the time.
How were you helping those people?
And,
How were you helping those people?
well, taking groceries, doing shopping for them, and helping sometimes a bit of housework or whatever seemed to be needed.
And when you came to Canada, you mentioned you came to Burnaby.
Burnaby first, yes.
And did you continue on in school then?
Yes, for a time, but I took a business course and became involved in the work of the municipality. I was with the Burnaby School Board first of all, and as the war was on at that time, and though I was still fairly young, the secretary went off, joined the forces, and I was left to more or less run the school board office, and that helped tremendously. I became intrigued with municipal government, and from there I was there for a few years and then transferred to the municipal hall and got a great deal of experience there in every department. So I had an unusually thorough grounding in those earlier days, and it was there. Burnaby was a fairly progressive municipality, and one of amongst the first to establish a juvenile court. And it was Mr. Stuart Jameson. He was the juvenile court judge, and I was doing court reporting and probation officer for girls. And you'd be interested, I think, that there had to be a separate a woman for the girls and a man for the boys. And one day Mr. Jameson said to me, you know, you should take social work. And I said, what's that? In those days, long ago, and we didn't know much about it. So it was he who told me about the School of Social Work in Toronto. And I went there, decided to take the course, and I was there from 1927 to 29.
And when you were there, what kinds of courses were you taking?
some of them were the regular academic courses, ethics, economics, anthropology, as well as an innocent sounding subject, hygiene, which turned out to be rather rough.
Why so?
Well, we were studying how the sewage disposal, about the sewage disposal in cities like New York and Chicago and things. A little bit off the beam, I thought, of social work, but and a lot of other things, and about disease and this and that and problems. And what did I say? Oh, and of course child welfare, group work, casework, psychology. Those were the main subjects.
A really broad range of subjects. Do you have a recollection of faculty, people who stand out in your mind?
Not really. There was a professor, I'm sure it was Professor Robinson, who in the ethics department, and Adelaide Sinclair was teaching economics at the time. Barbara Finlayson, I think it was family service, casework, and Mary McFedrin, teaching casework. Other than that, I don't remember.
Did you do a field placement when you were at school?
Yes, field work in a family agency for the first year, but I was very much intrigued in the second year. I did my field work in a cotton mill in Hamilton.
Oh.
And I had often wondered why industry, we hadn't been able to follow through on that, because I think it's a wide open field for social work. There are many, many problems. And I think as I said in the beginning, I came from Cheshire, and that's very much in the center of the Industrial Revolution, Lancashire mostly. And I was very intrigued. My first day on the job in the cotton mill, we started at 6:30 in the morning, and the woman who was supervising me came from Lancashire, and she called me Amy me love. But that was a very good experience.
What kind of work were you doing there?
Well, this was a new experiment, and it wasn't very well organized. But and so I was working really with the people on the looms, or with them, talking to them and finding out about their problems. It was a very interesting thing, but it has to be a bit vague, because I don't think it had been done before, and I doubt that it was carried on. But I enjoyed it, and I really felt that there were a lot of problems, many women working in the mill, and they had families, and really I thought there was a lot could be done.
What were the working conditions like for the people in the mills at that time?
Oh, I don't think I could really answer that, because they everything seemed to be all right, but to really, I suppose there was a lot we didn't see on the surface. I really don't know.
No, I wasn't thinking of myself anyway of being particularly critical. It's just that I think that in days past, hours of work were longer, and
Oh, yes.
There was less attention perhaps to safety
Yes,
standards and
yes.
things like that.
Oh, it was a different world. The hours of work were longer, and pay was low. But it was an interesting experience.
When you finished, did you obtain a master's at the university?
No. just a diploma.
It was a diploma program then?
Mhm.
What did you do after you finished your diploma work?
Well, I came back to Vancouver, and I worked in the city social service department, and I was there as a caseworker, and stayed for about 2 years. Conditions were not good. There were a lot of people on relief. We were just heading for the depression, but didn't know it. And in the basement of the building in which this organization was situated, there was a grocery store. And while the basic foods were given, there were a lot of dried peas and beans and no thought of nutrition and very little meat. And conditions were really bad. Now, at that point, a survey was going on. And well, we thought, the social workers thought, that they should be giving checks, but that was a bit too big a jump, so they did abandon the grocery store, and they gave scrip.
Mm-hmm.
And that was very closely supervised to be sure that they didn't buy any luxuries. It was a poor setup, and there were problems within the department, and I remained there only for 2 years at that time.
Mm-hmm. You'd mentioned that there was a survey going on. Who was doing the survey and what were they trying to do?
I think the survey people, George Davidson, Laura Holland, people from experienced people, mostly from Ontario, and they were looking into the general conditions because there was a good deal of criticism, and they wanted to improve conditions in the city from a social work point of view. So it was a very timely survey.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. At that time, 1929 to 1931, I guess is the time you were there, were you at all involved with the development of the professional association, the Canadian Association of Social Workers?
Yes, I was a member. And we had our meetings, of course, but yes, I was a member.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Was the association at all involved in the survey that was
No,
going
because
on?
it was too young at that time. You see, there was no School of Social Work at UBC. I had to go to Toronto to get the course, and things had really not developed at this end of the country too well. And so the association was very young, just a handful of people, and there were very few trained people around.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually the only one in the city social service department at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a bit too early for the association to take any active part in that.
Mm-hmm. After you were at City Social Services for a while, what induced you to leave, and where did you go?
Well, although I was so interested in public welfare, always have been, and it was really what I wanted to do, at that time there was absolutely no, you couldn't do anything. There was trouble within the department administratively, and things were at a standstill as far as any development or progress was concerned. And I felt that a bit of experience outside, and particularly in a private agency, would be good experience. And I was offered the job in the, as supervisor in the CNIB, and so I decided to make the change. And I'm rather glad I did. I came back to public welfare and stayed with it, but it was a good experience.
What what did you find when you were working with the CNIB? How were things different from where you've been?
Well, of course, different, I suppose. The main difference is that naturally everybody was blind or nearly blind, would have only guiding vision, and that in itself was a problem. But apart from that, of course, they were the ordinary problems that one finds in any family or in the individual. It was very little different in that sense. But we had to give special attention to the blind because of their disability.
Mm-hmm. In the city social service department, I assume that a lot of your time had been spent distributing funds and script and that sort of thing. Were you doing the same kind of work with CNIB, distributing money?
Oh, no. Well, the first thing, no. The first thing we did in the CNIB was to make a complete survey of the number of blind in the province, because there had not been any close follow-up. And of course, finally got that settled and knew who they were and where they were. And then through the province at that time, there were known as relief agencies, a lot of unemployment, and there were relief offices established in most of the centres. And so we made arrangements with them to work through them so that they could let us know about how people were getting along. But as far as assistance was concerned, they would get, if they needed it, would get it through the regular source. Mm-hmm. The job of the CNIB, really, we provided home teachers, arranged for training for the children, you know, in the school for the blind. There was a broom factory in Vancouver where a lot of people were employed. Many of them had these little kiosks, you know, and we arranged all that sort of thing, where they sold, you know, cigarettes and tobacco and goodness, all that sort of thing. And then there was the visiting in the homes, of course, and they had, well, the problems were very much the same as any others.
Mm-hmm. You were working with the board of directors, I assume, with
Yes.
the CNIB. How was that? How did that compare with working in a public welfare setup, in a government setup that you've been in before?
Well, it worked very well because the people who were on the board, the men and women, were certainly dedicated women, board members, and they were there to keep an eye on things, to have their monthly reports where reports were given and how things were developing. That's quite different, though, because they are local citizens who are giving of their time, and they have a great deal of interest, naturally, in what they're doing. But you see, in a public agency, if you're in a municipality, the council, the city council would be comparable. If you're in the province, and the elected members there are responsible, you don't see much of them. And yes, you feel a little further removed in a public agency from those who are actually in control as far as the total job goes than you do at least than I did in the, but not to any detriment.
Mm-hmm.
necessarily.
Not necessarily. No. No. Um, what was the staffing of that agency like at that time?
Uh, well, there were no trained social workers until I went there, and it was very small. There was a secretary, and there had been just one social worker known as a supervisor, and then, and of course, there was the director of the organization, but not much staff, just clerical staff really, with one social worker. But then we did, when we got things really organized and saw the need, we did have another social worker.
Mm-hmm. You were, I understand, responsible for both British Columbia and Alberta in that
Yes.
job. Did you travel much?
Yes, a great deal. Mostly to Edmonton and Calgary, of course. But that was very interesting. I found it just intriguing because we really had to build from scratch almost. There was one home teacher in Calgary, and there was a director had been appointed. There was nothing, no services in Edmonton. And so that was where we went and worked through the Lions Club, established a women's auxiliary, and got things working in the usual way, and appointed staff, and but that took a long time, and it was quite very interesting. I well remember that in 1935, when I was there, the new government had just been appointed, and I had the privilege of going to the first session of this new government. And I often think of it now because I suppose it happens so often that at that first session they seem to do nothing but throw out all the legislation that the previous government had enacted and push through about 30 new acts that same afternoon. It was really very interesting.
Mm-hmm. From a public welfare point of view, particularly.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay, you decided for some reason to leave the CNIB and return to the field of public welfare.
Yes, I was not at all dissatisfied with the CNIB. I had enjoyed my experience there. But for some reason or other, I always wanted and believed wholeheartedly in public welfare. And after this survey was made, I think one of the recommendations was that they needed a director of welfare. And I was approached and took the job.
Mm-hmm.
That was the way that happened. I got back to the agency where I really wanted to be.
Mm-hmm. So you came into a new position.
Mm-hmm.
What did you hope to accomplish there?
Well, I suppose like any social worker, I hope to see conditions improve for the people we were serving. That's the important thing. And there had been many changes I'd been away from it for 6 years, and certainly things were better. As I said, the old grocery store had gone, and by this time there were a few trained social workers in the department, and it was quite different. But it was in the heart of the Depression, and the unemployment was heavy. And one of the things that we felt should at least be looked into was this question of decentralization, because there was a lot of trouble in Vancouver, and one day just to give you an example, we were all locked in our offices by the RCMP because of an uprising around the building and trying to enter the building. People, irate citizens who thought that everything was wrong, and it was. Some of them, they had good reason, things were not good. But
so
however...
the staff was locked in the offices.
Mhm, mhm.
At some time around this time, I'm not sure when, you'll probably undoubtedly know more about the dates than I, the post office in Vancouver
Mhm.
had been occupied by the unemployed.
That's right. Yes, it was
The same kind of thing?
Yes, same kind of thing, yeah.
Mhm.
They were trying to get into the offices. But another thing that always worried me was that people had to come in. By this time, checks were given, and people had to come in for those checks, and they'd be standing in line in the rain or whatever, and there were too many in one center, and this was one of my great hopes, that we would be able to decentralize and then serve the people in their own districts, rather than bringing them all down to one center office. It wasn't good.
Mm-hmm. So how did you go about accomplishing that goal?
Well, I remember so well working it out more or less on paper, if you know what I mean, thinking where the offices might be roughly, and also how many clients would be in that particular area, and a lot of detail. And this was most acceptable as far to the administrator of the day, and then of course he had to take it from there through the city council and get the whole plan. And the province became very intrigued with this idea, because we did establish north, south, east and west district offices, and we decided to use the south unit as an experimental base, and the province was very interested, and they said they would send a supervisor over. They paid for the rent for the office we occupied, gave us some furniture. Really, it was a cooperative thing, and we set that up first on this experimental basis, and we divided. It was done quite arbitrarily, but we took 1,000 cases, and then we had 10 workers plus a supervisor. The workers had 100 cases each, and we visited, found out what the problems were, gave whatever help we could, and inside of 5 or 6 months, the caseload had been cut by half. Now, and that did not include those who had joined the armed forces, but this was the kind of thing we thought really was possible if we had the staff and the facilities to do the job. Now, before that, and through a lot of the whole years of the Depression, there were a lot of people in assistance, and they had worked out just a mechanical type of operation where families were visited every 3 months, and they knew when to expect them, and once the visitor had called, they knew that was through for another 3 months. And then when they got to the office, they had a rubber stamp and simply put visited in the file. So we had no knowledge of what the problems were, whether anything could be done, and that was really the objective of the whole thing, and it certainly worked well.
So what you were doing then is making a transition from financial assistance work to casework.
Well, yes, because I believed wholeheartedly that, and I still do, that a good job done at the assistance giving level prevents many problems.
Uh-huh.
You see, we found many situations where there was possible delinquency, troubles in the family, and not setting ourselves up in competition with family service agencies, far from it, but using common sense, the facilities that were available, and a great deal can be done.
Mm-hmm. Also, somewhere around the same period of time, the provincial government became interested in this idea of decentralization as applied to the province.
Oh yes, that was really why, yes.
So,
Well, yes, when the deputy minister asked me about this job, it was the same principle that he wanted applied.
who was that?
Mr. Griffiths, the deputy minister of welfare for the province, a very wonderful person, really, a man of feeling and concern for others, and if it hadn't been for his backing and his concern about people, we wouldn't have been able to introduce the program we eventually did.
Mm-hmm. So you were getting support from the provincial government for the idea, and also financial support through them paying rent and things. What about how did people within the profession, for other agencies, and within the School of Social Work, what was happening with them at this time about decentralization and a move toward casework and that sort of thing?
Not very much. That's a very difficult thing. The School of Social Work, and I think would be true of all maybe, they were not altogether attuned to the public welfare problem. A lot of you see, at first they couldn't put students into the public welfare. I'm not blaming the schools, because there was no one to supervise them. And this is what I mean about the lag, whereas in the private agencies there were trained people and they could concentrate their attention more. I don't think, well, I'm sure that at the time, because this was fairly early on, you know, and the association really wasn't involved at all. They knew what was going on, but things were quite different then, and these organizations were very young, you know.
Mm-hmm. The involvement of professional social workers, professionally trained social workers in public welfare had been a matter of some contention, had it not, in years previous?
Yes. If I just go on to the provincial job, see, one of the things when we got looking at the whole program, it was something similar to the one in Vancouver, but on a much larger scale. We felt and we knew that the people in the outlying areas were not getting the service they deserved. Now, and I must make it clear that we were not thinking that we could give all the services that were available in a larger center, but we were convinced that we could do a better job in quite remote areas, really, by paying a little more attention. Now, in order to do that, we had to have staff. Our School of Social Work here was young. They were not turning out enough for us. We could have, oh my goodness, we needed staff, and they were, from the school, they were simply not available. So we started an in-service training program. And I think we were extremely careful about it. We didn't take anyone who could go to this. We urged them to take the formal training. But they, in choosing the people for the job, we took a lot of things into account. Education, aptitude, desire to do this kind of work, ability to be mobile, that was important, and many other things. And then when we got the thing going, we had a very good teacher. Director of the in-service program was Martha Moskov. She had been a former teacher and had taken social work, and she did really an excellent job to meet our need, not to go beyond our need. We were not setting up a miniature school of social work, but we couldn't have done without it. Now, that was not very popular with the profession, as you can imagine. And even though we were not interfering at all, in fact, we were sending people to the school. And we also gave leave of absence to our in-service people later on to go to the school when they could. So, but I think you can understand that with the profession, it was looked upon as a bit of a second-rate deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose today we might call those people with the in-service training paraprofessionals.
Yes, yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were awfully good. We made some mistakes, of course. Took on one or two people that were not much
Mm-hmm.
shakes.
To go back then for a moment, when you were to the time when you were director of welfare for the city, what kinds of pressures were you facing in that job
Where was this?
when you were with the city?
With the city?
Back to the city.
None whatever, really. That's a strange thing when I look back. But there was really, you would mean pressure to not to change the program or to carry on as we were, or not spend money. Is that the kind of pressure?
Whatever pressure there might have been to make things difficult for you in your job.
Well, there were some difficulties, mostly personal, you know, the personalities. Some people liked the program and a few didn't, and thought we were going a bit too far. Oh, I don't look upon that as anything unusual. No, and then because of our jumping to the province now, because of Mr. Griffith, the deputy minister, and his association with the minister, really everything went very smoothly. We didn't seem to have too much difficulty.
The war broke out, and Canada joined in 1939.
39, yeah.
How did that change your work as director of welfare for the city?
Well, of course, it changed it in two ways. First, the caseload, of course, was reduced tremendously, and there were not the same, if you use the word pressures, not the same pressures quite for the staff, you see, as had been. But the real change was the evacuation of the Japanese, and that came about very quickly right after Pearl Harbor, and I think sometimes people in other parts of the country perhaps forget that we were very close to Pearl Harbor in terms of airplanes, one thing or another. And there was a panic. Really, I think the people did panic a bit. And it was felt that the Japanese had to be evacuated. There were about between 23 and 24,000 in British Columbia on the coast, and most of them in the defense area. I think too that the Japanese had to be moved for their own safety. It's difficult perhaps to explain to people who have never lived through a war situation, and it was really that, because for us, I mean, it definitely was for the Americans, but we were very close to it. And as I say, the people in the province demanded their evacuation from the coast. So the federal government appointed the BC Security Commission. And I think that was one time they did a very good thing, because they appointed British Columbians who really knew the job and knew the people. Austin Taylor headed the thing up. He was what was known as a $1-a-year man, meaning he didn't work for a salary. But they had to take on quite a staff. But it was interesting that they appointed not only people to look after them at Hastings Park, but saw that there was medical attention, thought about social work, and tried to make the thing as reasonable as could be under very difficult circumstances. So they started to come into Hastings Park, and that was unfortunate. It was very sad, but had to be. And but one interesting point, there were between 23 and 24,000. But one of the first things that was done, apart from housing them and settling down and being sure that they were properly fed and as well looked after as they could be, a lot of them were found jobs. The sugar beet industry in Alberta and Manitoba took many. Some went to lumber camps in Ontario. Many of the girls got domestic work here and there. Some found jobs for themselves. A few could look after themselves financially. And when all that sorting out was done, we had only 11,000 out of the 24,000 to accommodate in the interior of the province. Mm-hmm. And they went to 7 centres. And of course there's hardly anything good to be said about it. I mean, it was a tragedy. So many of them were really loyal Canadian citizens, but it was, well, we have to remember it was a war situation. However, we speak of concentration camps and hear a great deal about it, but these so-called concentration camps were many, many miles apart, and the people were in shacks and abandoned houses, and the supervisors were there to see that the plumbing worked and the electricity. In 3 of the centres, children went to school, and the social work job, of course, was to see that they had, a certain amount of child welfare work, group work, to see that they were getting their allowances and the usual things. And then with the nurses, the medical attention they could get, I think everything was done that possibly could be done. One interesting thing, I was at head office in Vancouver, but I took many trips through the area, of course. And one day I was driving along, it was beautiful country, and driving along the lakeside, and I saw a young Japanese lad walking, and I picked him up. And I said, well, what are the problems? Could you tell me? What is your people feel about it? Well, he said, as far as I'm concerned, there are too many damn Japanese around. I don't know what they're talking about. And of course, he was a native born, you see. And another lad, I asked the same question, what he did before this happened. And he said, oh, I was a jitterbug dancer. So I didn't think we could find him a job. But it was sad. But perhaps one thing I should mention is that when it was all over, you have no idea how many friends our people, not just social workers, but all the staff, had made with the Japanese. They used to tell me about getting letters from them after they were dispersed, and one young man who started his own business in Ontario immediately wrote to his supervisor and offered him a job, which the man took. And, you know, there were nice bits about it. It wasn't all as bad as sometimes it's said to be, but still not pleasant.
Mm-hmm. You were involved in this because you were seconded to the BC Security Commission.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
I've talked to other people other social workers who were in war situations in Europe. I'm wondering how your social work training and background affected your ability to go through this difficult period and this task that must have seemed insurmountable at times.
I don't know. Well, of course, it had a bearing. There could be no doubt about that. Because with my past experience, and particularly in public welfare and dealing with a lot of people and organizing, yes, that certainly helped. Because one of the most difficult jobs, perhaps that I had during this time, was to establish policy. And I think perhaps my experience helped in that, because there were so many federal governments to deal with. Not that I was dealing with them personally, all of them, but you know, there was the Secretary of State, Finance, Justice, Mines and Resources. There were 6 of them altogether involved. And then again, the distance, Ottawa, Vancouver, somebody sitting at a desk not quite understanding what it's all about. Now that I find one of the most difficult things in many areas in government.
Mm-hmm. The distance.
But I'm quite sure that my social work training helped, because, oh yes, and then you know the laws of the country, you know what's available. If you want to go back to the city days, there was only old age pension at $25 a month, which was on a means test basis. There was no social security, no family allowance. In the middle, a little bit later on, there was a mother's allowance, no Canada pension, no unemployment insurance. You see, so we naturally had to get used to just what was there. The story today is entirely different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, getting back just to the war situation, do you have any thoughts about how well social work principles and ethics apply in a crisis?
I think they're very limited. I think they have to be one has to be very practical and accept a situation as it is. We cannot think of policies or what we're going to do if only such things had happened, or this shouldn't have been. You have to forget all about that and what the ideal thing would be to face a situation if it is war, because you can't do anything about that. That is the problem.
Mm-hmm.
That is the basic problem. The war itself.
Mm-hmm. And then, so one tries to apply what one can of the
Yes.
principles that you know.
Yes, you want principles, you keep to your own principles as far as is humanly possible, but we have to always remember the situation in which we're working, which is not desirable really. If it's war, it's anything but desirable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to be flexible
Mm-hmm.
and still know that we can help people no matter, or we should be able to, no matter what the situation, but it might be very limited.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm wondering if that would be a good place to take a break.
All
Would you
right.
like to stop for a few
Mhm.
minutes?
Oh, I'll finish this.
We can get you some warm. Okay, Ms. Lee, when we stopped to have our coffee, you had been discussing your work at the BC Security Commission. Where did you go after you left the City of Vancouver Welfare Department?
Well, after the BC Security Commission, I was back with the city for some months, and early in 1943, I went to the province as Assistant Director of Welfare.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really because the Deputy Minister, who had been involved and knew about the decentralization in Vancouver, had thought it advisable to amalgamate the offices in the province. There were two types. In most centres there were relief offices. In quite a few of the larger centres there were welfare offices, the latter dealing with child welfare and family problems, both belonging to the same government but in separate offices and really quite apart from each other. And so one of the jobs was to amalgamate the offices and therefore do a better job, bring the two together. And in the relief offices there were, for the most part, older men with no training, but a wonderful feeling for people for the most part. And in the welfare offices, there were either older women with a lot of experience or young graduates trained. And these two, it was a very difficult but interesting job to bring them together.
How did you do that? How did you go about amalgamating their interests?
Well, I should mention, first of all, our in-service program.
You had mentioned that. Mm-hmm.
I've mentioned that,
Mhm.
haven't I?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we brought all these men in whenever we could for training. And there was a great deal of upset about it. They didn't want to go back to school and didn't see why they should. But however, our teacher was very director of the program, was very good, and they found that they liked it, that they were learning a lot, and even later on asked for another short course. This was the first thing to be done, to give them a bit of insight into what the total welfare job could be. There was then, on the other hand, you see, particularly the young graduates, well, they were fresh out of school with all kinds of ideas, and they knew what to do. And it was a very difficult marriage, if I may call it that. But however, we finally got it sorted out, and but even after we had them sort of amalgamated them from an office point of view, one day, to my great surprise, I found that the relief men were still keeping their files separate, and the others were keeping their files separate, even though they belonged to the same family. But it was a slow job, but we really did it, finally get it done.
Somewhere during that period of time in British Columbia, there was a great discussion about whether or not the workers should be generic generalist workers or specialist workers. Was that debate occurring at this time?
Well, yes. In a way, the reason we were not perhaps too closely involved is that we simply had no choice. We had to have generalized workers. It's a vast province. What is it? 360,000 square miles, and no government could afford specialists, even in centers, to serve many offices. But what we did have consultants, and they were the specialists, attached to the head office in Victoria rather than out in the field. And they were available for consultation. And one of the things we did was set up a family service division. You see, if you think of the central organization, you have a child welfare division, a psychiatric division, you have many divisions, but no family service division. So we established that, which meant that we had consultant at head office who could write and help with problems, and who also, like the other consultants, visited the field and became involved in very difficult cases. But I think it's only in very large centers that you can have specialists I was very much in favor of the generalized, because there we were out in the woods to a great extent, and small communities. You had to be able to do something on the job without you couldn't call specialists. One other good thing was that we had a child guidance clinic attached to the psychiatric division, and they traveled through the province about twice, couldn't do the whole province, but through different areas. They'd make probably 2 trips a year, and that was a tremendous help. And so this is the way we had to get any specialist attention. Otherwise, it was a matter of the generalized and using a lot of common sense, using community resources, and not pretending that we were doing the total job. We couldn't.
I understand from my reading of your interests and your background that staffing and staff development has been a great interest of yours. given the size of British Columbia, and workers were required to travel, do you think that there's a difference, or should there be a difference between workers who must go to remote areas and those who work in urban settings?
Well, I think that a great deal could be done to prepare those who work in remote areas for what they're going to have to face. And yes, I really do think there could be a difference. In a city like Vancouver, we have psychiatrists, all kinds of medical attention available. Everything is in a large city. And yet, we really were always concerned. We felt that the people in the remote areas were neglected. So I do think that the workers could be better prepared for that kind of work. The other thing is that it's very difficult to get people to go to these areas, go and live there. And they have to be fairly rugged. I could tell you of one or two experiences. One time, when I was in Victoria, a report came across my desk from the RCMP, and it said that one of our workers had been traveling along the so-called highway. Don't mistake that with any highway you know today. And through, it was very dark, it was at night, it was very dark, there was no moon, just the headlights of the car, about 100 miles to travel to get back to her home for the weekend in Prince Rupert. Now, she shouldn't have been traveling at night, but anyway, I guess she wanted to get home for the weekend. And anyway, along the way, she collided with a bear crossing the road. And in the report it said that one of the headlights had been broken, which didn't help. The front of the car had been smashed in a bit, and there were bear hairs all over. But the driver was not injured and reported the accident the minute she returned. And to this day, I've been wondering what happened to the bear. Another instance was in one of our northern districts, and the worker wanted to see the man of the house, which meant going at night. He was working, and she was staying at the moment in an old mining town, Barkerville, up through the Caribou. And she could go by car a certain distance and then had to walk. And she had to walk up a skid road and over rather rough territory. And really shouldn't have been doing it at night, but nevertheless she was. And so the interview was finished and she was walking home, and she was paced by wolves all the way home. Well, perhaps not too dangerous, but at least unnerving at night. She said there was a moon, though, which helped.
Excuse me. The perils of being a rural social worker.
Yes.
My goodness. Continuing on then with the period of time when you were Assistant Director of Welfare for the province, what kinds of issues were current at the time? How was financing? What were people feeling toward welfare?
Well, I think financing is always difficult. It's always with us, and there are always complaints about it. However, I must say that during my time with the province, we were not seriously involved in any restraint program or cuts. Now, that didn't mean that we could go beyond a certain point in development, but really, when I look back, I was extremely fortunate. I don't think I ever encountered any political interference until the end of this particular job.
Until you left this job in 1958, something was happening at that time that made things
Oh,
difficult?
yes, in 58 I became 60. And I decided to retire
Uh-huh.
at 60.
You mentioned some issue with, was it the interference of politicians in what you were trying to do, or what was going on?
Well, in 1952, a new government was elected, and this is exactly what can be expected. They had entirely different views about welfare, quite the opposite to what we'd been used to. And it is true that at that point things started to go wrong, that is from my point of view, and the whole concept, everything changed. But regardless of that, I did, when I left, it was because I had decided to retire earlier than I needed to. It wasn't really because of the political situation, but just that I needed a rest.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I have my dates right here, but from about 1942 to 1952, British Columbia had a coalition government under which many
Well, yes, we had a coalition. We had, I think, 1 year of, oh, I forgot whether it was Liberal or Conservative, and then a coalition government, yes, during the part of the war period, yeah.
And many of the developments of which you spoke came about during that period. With the election of a different government, a one-party government instead of a coalition, it might be informative if you would tell us what kinds of changes came about. This was 32 years ago. It would be interesting for me to know if the same things have happened, well, to think about whether the same things have happened again. What kinds of changes did you see?
Well, we were told, first of all, that they didn't believe in welfare. And that as there had to be, they believed in industry and employment. And I pointed out that there were many old people, neglected children, all the rest of it. But yes, they acknowledged that and said that they knew nothing whatever about the program and did not find out, and said that it would be based, and they mentioned on the practice in another province, which was not too well known for its good welfare, and they just were quite determined to change the policies. We had published a magazine, which maybe sound a little off, but it was very good, and it had wide circulation. It was called BC's Welfare, and it helped the staff, and it became rather popular, and it had a fair circulation. Well, they stopped that. Perhaps that was fair enough. And then the in-service fell through. Now, it was diminishing because it was a program that we only put in as an emergency. We knew that when schools were turning out enough people, we wouldn't go to the expense of an in-service program. But that was stopped. And then, you see, I left in 1958, and then, during and after that, I don't mean because I left, but as the years went by, a lot of changes were made. And I'm not entirely familiar with the program today, but I know that I'm afraid it's a little more mechanical than we would like it to be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. additional things that you'd like to comment on about your work as the Assistant Director of Welfare for the province?
I've just forgotten what I've covered. I think, no, I think perhaps I've covered it. It was an extremely interesting time, and there was always so much happening. But as I said, the important thing, well, we did really manage to bring better services to people in the outlying areas, and that was very important to us. Because if you look around, or we looked around at that time, most of the services were concentrated in large centres. So I don't think there's anything else to say about that.
Okay. I'd like to move now to 2 or 3 summary questions, if I might.
Yes.
One question would be, as you think back over the years in which you were involved in public welfare from, what, 1929
Yes.
to 1958, would you speculate on what are the most significant developments in public welfare over those years?
Well, when I think of what was not available in the 20s, and I think what is available now and was even in 1958, it was the development of a number of universal programs, such as old age security and family allowances and various things. And I feel one of the big differences now, no matter what we may say about recession or depression, it is that almost everybody has something. Old people have old age security, there is family allowance, there's unemployment insurance, Canada pension. You could go on with all the programs. And that, well, when you think, I know it's over a fairly long period, but it's an entirely different picture.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are the significant things that have happened. I sometimes wonder if we're going a bit too far. So,
With too many programs? A bit too far in that we have too many programs?
Yes. I'm awfully glad we have what we have. I'm not in any sense criticizing that. But I sometimes wonder, I'm all in favor of universal programs, because as an administrator, I know what would be involved in this country if we had to go into every case getting Social Security or family allowance or whatever. We'd just be loaded with civil servants doing nothing but checking, and I don't approve of that. But I do think somewhere there should perhaps be a break-off, that people in the really higher incomes could well do without it. And that's the only thing, I think. I like the programs we have, but they can be very, very a great burden on the taxpayer if, when everybody gets these things. However, that's for the politicians, I suppose, not me.
Yeah. Again, as you think back over the years, I'm wondering if there are accomplishments of yours that you're particularly pleased about.
That I was pleased about? Don't know whether I thought of them as accomplishments at the time. I don't know. You go on day by day and do your job, and you don't. I think perhaps the I think the possibility of bringing services to people who did not have services may be one of the things. And yet, just think all the people who are involved in that program. This is why I would hesitate to think I had my share in it and believed in it and did what I could, but it couldn't have been carried out without a lot of people involved.
Mhm.
So,
Okay. And a last question would be what it has meant to you to be a professional social worker.
well, it's meant a great deal to me. I think it has given me perhaps a sense of security, almost in a way, in belonging to a profession of this type, knowing that after all, it is a service profession, and also knowing that through the years, I'm quite sure that we were able to do more in the jobs that I've described because of training and understanding, I think in my case, understanding the role of government and never expecting too much and knowing that there are limits and this kind of thing. But it has meant a great deal to me. Also in friendships, just remarkable. I've known some of the finest men and women through the years. I think that would be almost the biggest thing I would
Mhm.
mention. Just remarkable people.
Anyone you'd care to mention?
Hmm?
Is there anyone you'd care to mention?
Well, I think of Laura Holland, who had, she was a social worker in Toronto, and in the 30s came out here. She was first with the Child Welfare Organization, Children's Aid, and then she was superintendent of child welfare for a while, and was with the government when I joined it, and she believed wholeheartedly in in-service training and was a great help, and yes, she was a wonderful person. Oh, there's so many of them. I think also of Lina Mess, who was a great strength in our department. She established the Family Service Division, and it was mostly through her enthusiasm and knowledge that we got that going. I think of Martha Moscroft, who was our Director of In-Service Training and who did a supervisory job with the Japanese during the Japanese evacuation, published the magazine, or edited the magazine, and so many people. I wish I could mention them all, but those the friendships today mean so much to me, of so many of my professional colleagues. Oh, and then I think of people in other parts, not just Vancouver, and many Americans. When I was doing quite a bit with the American Public Welfare Association, I had some very close friends through the States. So that's probably the best of it all.
Okay, I'm wondering if there are other things that you'd like to add.
Oh, I don't think so. Unless you have any other questions. The only thing I could mention is that after retiring, and I really mean retiring, I had no thought of any further work, but I did act as consultant in number of places. Newfoundland, the Yukon, Winnipeg, Ottawa City, and that was very interesting.
You were acting as a consultant because of your experience with public welfare?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And there were some results that came out of those consultations, I understand.
Well, I think with some of them, it was the first introduction they'd had. I think perhaps of Newfoundland, which had only come into Confederation 2 years before, and perhaps the Yukon. And the first introduction they'd had to any type of social work or ideas of social work. You see, there were departments. And speaking of people I met, in Newfoundland I met Stuart Godfrey, another very good friend and a man I admire very greatly. And in the Yukon, for instance, I know that I was able to get more funding for them because social work wasn't understood and the needs, and a lot of money went to the health department, and so it should, but it was easier to get it for health than it was for social work.
Mm-hmm.
And there you really, as you can understand at that time, there were again no trained social workers, you see. And however, one of the men took the social work course, and I think it's about all you can say is that you introduce social work, get them thinking about it, do what you can at the time, and then that's about all you can do in certain areas. In Ottawa, it was a bigger job. Social workers were, of course, well known there, but what was needed there was certainly, again, a director. And that is when I was fortunately able to get Stuart Godfrey, and the program developed, I think.
Mm-hmm.
They were all interesting in their own way, and each was different from the other. There was no pattern you could really establish.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you very much for the time you spent with me this morning. I regret that we can't get together again and again and again, but this morning's been very helpful and most interesting.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Much appreciated.
7. Well, I don't know. I think maybe the pictures enough, is it? Well, I got it because of my work with the American Public Welfare Association, you see.
What had you done with them? Because we didn't mention.
Oh,
that in the
well,
interview.
I was on their board of directors at one time. I went to many of their conferences and made speeches and things. And then we invited them to Victoria for one of the meetings, and it really was a howling success, and I chaired that. And I knew the whole gang.